Dr Dylan Moloney-Gibb is one of the brightest young compassion researchers I know, and it's been a real pleasure watching him develop into such an outstanding scientist. Hi, I'm Dr Stan Steindl. Today I'm speaking with Dylan about his recent paper on the three circles model of compassion-focused therapy, published in Behaviour Research and Therapy. Dylan was the lead author, alongside Chase Sherwell, Sasha, Lynn and James Kirby. Dylan recently completed his PhD and is a researcher with the Compassionate Mind Research Group at the University of Queensland. His research focuses on one of the central ideas in compassion-focused therapy, the three circles model of emotion regulation. Together with his colleagues, he's been helping to develop and validate the digital Three Circles app, exploring how we can measure threat, drive, and soothing in real time, and how these patterns relate to physiological measures such as heart rate variability. In this conversation, we unpack the research, what it tells us about the science behind the Three Circles model, and what it might mean for therapists, researchers, and anyone interested in understanding how our minds and bodies regulate emotion. And so I bring you Dr. Dylan Moloney-Gibb. Dr. Dylan Moloney-Gibb, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I like compassion and t-shirts, so I appreciate this.
This is like your natural environment, mate.
Yeah, 100%. It's appealing to all my interests, you know.
Recently, you were lead author on a April 2026 paper, so hot off the presses, the three-circle model of compassion-focused therapy, an experimental paradigm to assess dynamic psychophysiological changes of emotion regulation systems. So
Yeah, that's the one. It's a mouthful. And if we'd known that someone was going to say it out loud, we probably would have shortened the title. But
that's why.
we did that.
That's why I thought I'd just sort of read it out to you. But and I definitely want to dive into that paper, of course, and what you found there. But first, for people who maybe haven't seen it, there's now this digital Three Circles app that lets people map their emotional state, I guess, in real time. Could you tell us a bit about the app, what people can do with it, why you think it might be a useful tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously a presupposition of compassion-focused therapy is the tripartite model of emotion and motivation, or the three-circle model, which basically breaks down your emotions into three systems that are linked to physiology, that are responsible for your experiences of emotion. The idea is that emotions, I guess, serve as motivation to respond to environmental stimuli. So your first system, your most important system, obviously, is your threat system. So that's responsible for your experiences of negative emotion. So anger, fear, and disgust, for example. And this system is running off your sympathetic nervous system, that arm of your autonomic nervous system, which is, I guess, colloquially referred to as the fight or flight system. So basically, the idea is that these threat-based emotions serve to incentivize you to respond to the threat, right? To fight, flee, freeze, or appease. So that's one of your systems. And then you've got your drive system, which is responsible for your experiences of positive activated emotion. So that's like joy, for example. And that's running off your sympathetic nervous system as well. But also there's, dopamine involvement in terms of the fact that, when you're anticipating a reward, you get a little dopamine hit. And the idea is that this system incentivizes you to go out and accumulate resources that are advantageous to you for your survival. So food, water, social standing, all of that. And then finally, you've got your soothing system, which is not merely an absence of threat and drive. It's a distinct system in and of itself. So that's running off your parasympathetic nervous system, right? Your rest and digest system. And so this system is responsible for your experiences of deactivated positive emotion. So like calmness and contentment and satisfaction. This system in particular is kind of like a crucial goal, or stimulating the system is a crucial goal of compassion-focused therapy. The idea is that, if you stimulate your soothing system, you can sort of regulate less useful levels of threat and drive, which may be sort of contributing to psychological distress, for example. I guess in terms of compassion focused therapy, a crucial sort of tool that's used in compassion focused therapy sessions, obviously, as you would know, is just drawing each of those systems as a different colored circle, right? So you've got green for your soothing, and then blue for your drive, and red for your threat. And the idea is that you draw them, according to sort of how you've been feeling. If you've been feeling particularly calm, you'll draw a big green circle. And so we were interested in sort of adapting this circle drawing practice, employed in compassion focused therapy, as a digital measure, to sort of, basically we were like, what if we operationalize this and we were able to sort of, use it to measure emotion? So that was the rationale, for the measure. And now we kind of validated it, and it's going out. Obviously, James has an app for it. So there, the potential uses, there's kind of like a plethora of them. So you can use it, most basically like as you would with the circle drawing exercise in therapy to sort of track changes in emotion. You can use it to sort of assess the efficacy of different techniques that you might be utilizing in therapy, right? So you can sort of go, oh, okay, well, my client came in this time and they had a big red circle at the start. And by the end of it, they had a much smaller red circle. So whatever I did here, let's do more of that. But you can use it in a variety of other contexts as well. So you can use it as a psychoeducational tool, to sort of help, particularly I think in sort of educational environments, schools, for example, to help kids understand their emotions, and to understand their three systems. You can use it, I guess, as sort of like an outcome measure in studies. And as we found in this paper, you can also use it within sort of, heart rate variability studies, to assess emotions alongside heart rate variability. So that was the kind of focus of this paper, was to assess whether this measure was sensitive to dynamic changes in emotion resultant from experimental manipulations.
Mm. Wow, great summary, mate. And
Thanks.
it is really interesting. I feel like from a clinical point of view, it really aids in mind awareness, I guess, isn't it? Being able
100%.
to use the app to, whether it's pre, post an exercise, or across a week, or in different contexts, or being able to just have that moment to stop and reflect, draw the circles on the app. It kind of tracks them, I think, over time, and you're left
Yep.
with sort of data there that can give you a sense of, like what are your three circles doing over time? What might be the dominant kind of circle, or the combination, really. I think that's something we'll talk about a bit later, is just the way that it's actually in the combination or balance, really, in across the three circles, which seems to be important. And it is a beloved model, I guess, in CFT, and kind of really practical. But until recently, it hadn't really been tested scientifically in a way. And so you've done a bit of a program of research. I mean, what was the gap really that your research was trying to fill?
Yeah, 100%. So I guess the relations between the systems had been previously established scientifically, in terms of like you had your I think Depew and Morone-Strapinski paper, which established that your two types of positive affect, your soothing system and your drive system, running off different arms of the autonomic nervous system, right? So you've got your soothing system running off parasympathetic and your drive system running off of sympathetic. And there's been a bunch of research in terms of measuring those three systems sort of in terms of just standard Likert scales. So I was a real big fan of Sasha and colleagues, I think is how you pronounce Ruben's name, over in Portugal at the University of Coimbra. So they'd done some basically some vignette studies using just sort of discrete emotions mapped to each one of those systems in terms of subscales. So you basically rate, I guess, like how much joy you're experiencing. Might be one of your discrete emotions mapped to like your drive system. So stuff like that's been done. You have your easel as well, which does the same thing. It's sort of just rating different discrete emotions that are mapped to individual subscales based on those three systems. But up until now, no one really examined interactivity between those systems, which is particularly important in terms of, I guess, the theory inherent to compassion-focused therapy, therapy, because the idea is that, according to the tripartite model, those systems aren't existing in isolation. They interact, and the idea is that they're meant to be sort of responding to environmental context. So that was mainly the gap we were trying to fill there. Is to, I guess, get a measure of system interactivity, and obviously to kind of do it in a way that is quite engaging, and might sort of mitigate, I guess, caveats associated with traditional self-report measures. Aspects like emotional or verbal literacy. Like my background was working with like young offenders and child safety kids, so children in care. And sometimes they wouldn't necessarily know what discrete emotions they are experiencing, right? You don't know whether what you're experiencing is sort of anger or fear sometimes. Sometimes it can be a bit of both. And so we figured that basically by breaking it down into just, those three systems, you don't necessarily have to be able to discern, how much of each of those individual emotions you're experiencing. You can just sort of go, okay, I've got a big red circle. So that was kind of the appeal there, and that was the literature gap that we were trying to fill there. And then obviously with this paper, we were trying to establish, that those ratings of the three circles, basically your ratings of emotion are corresponding to, what's going on physiologically. Because again, according to compassion focused therapy theory, your emotions, are inherently linked to your autonomic nervous system.
Mm. Just unpack a bit more for us
Yeah.
the advantage of sort of resizing these three circles. I
Yes.
guess there's a lot underneath that in a sense, and like what's that really measuring, and why might it tell us something that perhaps the traditional questionnaires might miss?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms, I guess that kind of goes into, what our measure is actually measuring there, like the quantitative units, I guess. And so the big one for us, in terms of that measure, is circle dominance. So basically it's calculated by, you take your area of one circle and then just divide it by the summed area of all your circles, which sort of converts it to a percentage, and basically tells you how much, your circle of interest is making up the total picture, comprised of all three circles, right? And then the idea is that they're kind of anchored to each other, right? So, if you have more of one circle, you're inherently going to have less of the other circles, and that does sort of map to physiology as well, where it's sort of like, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems can kind of act as like a seesaw. And so obviously with regards to exercises employed in compassion focused therapy, the big ones are kind of like soothing or compassion based exercises, which works on the principle of trying to activate your parasympathetic nervous system to sort of down regulate less useful levels of sympathetic activity, when it might not be particularly useful. So in terms of what that's measuring there, we're measuring, I guess, the balance between those systems, which is, I guess, a crucial assumption of the tripartite model.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, circle dominance in a way, and that's the circle that really is occupying the most percentage of the area is
Yes.
sort of the circle dominance, and if soothing system is kind of the dominant system, then that might sort of suggest something in particular about the current emotional state. I noticed you said earlier on, um, calm and rest and digest and those sorts of things. I see recently Paul Gilbert's been really clarifying that too, about also the sometimes activating aspects of soothing system as well, and that soothing system might also be related to play or exploring or things like that. Did you have any comments on some of those recent thoughts?
Yeah, well, I guess for me, it's sort of like what's particularly interesting or pertinent about the soothing system is that it co-develops alongside emotion regulation and attachment, right? Because that kind of, it makes sense in hindsight, where it's like, well, you can't develop a stable attachment to a caregiver in an environment of threat, right? Your threat system is kind of dominant in that situation, and consequently that can basically that's implicated in later instances of, difficulties with emotion regulation. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is that the soothing system isn't necessarily as simple as just like, oh, like it's soothing, or it's just like low energy. Like it has a variety, it's implicated in a variety of functions, and play is a big one as well, because that is how you bond with caregivers a lot of the time, or even friends. So it does make a lot of sense that, the soothing system would be involved in instances of play.
Mm.
So I fully
Yeah.
agree with Paul on that one.
Yeah. That the sort of not just low energy. I think that's probably a
Exactly.
really important takeaway that it can be also sort of energy giving and activating and but if we bring it back to that kind of attachment system as a nice little kind of thing to anchor some of those ideas, it actually makes a lot of sense.
And that's
So,
why when I'm,
mm,
oh, sorry to interrupt, but I was
mm,
just gonna say, because I thought of it then, and I was like, yeah, that's also why when I'm like, when I'm describing the soothing system, sometimes people will go like low energy, positive emotion, and I try not to use that term for that reason. I'll use like deactivated positive emotion, right? Obviously, I guess like there's the same implication there, but I think there is sort of, that connotation of like, oh, the soothing system is inherently low energy, and I don't think that's the case at all. Like,
mm,
you can be chill while still having energy, right? And that's the nature of the interaction between those systems.
mm. And then, of course, even if soothing system is the dominant system, there'll be elements potentially of threat and drive that are still, in the bigger
Absolutely.
picture as well. So I guess it's quite complex, really, isn't it? It's a simple model in a way, and yet it actually encompasses some multiple layers of what it is to have a tricky brain sort of
Yeah,
thing.
that's what I was
So
gonna
yeah.
say. I was like many such cases, right? Yeah.
Mm. So in your study, you used, I think is it like the triple R paradigm:
Yes.
rest, rumination, and recovery, along
Technically,
with the
rest, reactivity, and recovery. I mean, like what we used was a rumination task, but reactivity just means sort of like whatever stimulus you're utilizing to sort of provoke a physiological response. But yeah, we
brilliant.
use
Okay.
rumination task.
So the triple R is rest, reactivation, and recovery.
Rest,
Um,
reactivity, and recovery.
Rest, reactivity, and
Sorry.
recovery, and you just happened to conveniently use another R, which was rumination for the reactivity part of it.
We like to keep things confusing so that I can correct people on podcasts and seem
Thank
really
you.
smart.
Just correct me, but without too much shame is
Yeah,
would be good.
exactly.
Well, anyway, yes. Well, tell us, talk us through the design and how you came up with that, to test your hypotheses.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess like in terms of like measuring heart rate variability, I guess like for the three people watching at home. No, you have more than me. If I was running it, it'd be like three people. Um, yeah. Basically, heart rate variability is a metric commonly used as like a proxy for your parasympathetic nervous system, so your rest and digest system. So the idea is that basically when you're chiller, you tend to have more heart rate variability, more variability in the interbeat intervals. So I guess like the gaps between your heartbeats. So that's effectively what heart rate variability is measuring, but static measures of heart rate variability don't necessarily tell you a whole lot. It's sort of more the contrast between rest and reactivity. That's sort of basically how you're actually able to gauge, the effectiveness of your parasympathetic nervous system at kicking in, right? So resting measures of heart rate variability, vary quite a lot between participants, and are sort of subject to a whole bunch of factors that can create noise. So any sort of like pre-existing health conditions, whether you've had caffeine, all of that can affect your sort of resting heart rate variability. So the idea is that you want to, I guess, like provoke reactivity in your experimental paradigm. to accurately gauge, the activity of your parasympathetic nervous system. So it's kind of like a gold standard, practice for measuring heart rate variability. So we went for, the rest, reactivity, recovery paradigm. So basically you just get people to come in, you get them to sit for like 6 minutes and don't think about anything in particular, don't do anything in particular. You just wait there. And then in our case, we wanted to provoke, I guess, like the sympathetic nervous system. So we used a rumination task where you basically just think about something stressful that's happened and kind of dwell on it, with the idea being that it'll kind of activate your threat system, and your sympathetic nervous system, and that'll show up in your heart rate variability readings. And then you have recovery afterwards, to basically examine how, your heart rate variability theoretically should increase again after the rumination, because you're no longer sort of exposed to a stressful stimulus. And then we also chucked the compassion task at the end as well, just because obviously the assumption of compassion tasks is that's how they work, right? Basically they'll activate your soothing system, which will consequently result in reduced sympathetic activity, because it's stimulating your parasympathetic nervous system. So that's why we wanted to chuck the compassion task at the end there.
What was the compassion task?
Yeah, so the idea of that compassion task was to sort of think about different people in succession. So you first start with someone who you're quite close to, who it's easy to feel compassion for, and then you just basically try and direct compassionate wishes to them. So wishing that they would be free from suffering, understanding that they're sort of navigating life's tricky waters, the same as anyone else. They have good days and bad days, and then successively attempting to impart those wishes on people that you might find that you're more distant from. So maybe a neutral person, like someone that you don't know that well, that you've maybe served you coffee earlier or something like that. And then maybe someone that you're struggling with, who it would be harder to generate compassionate wishes for.
Mm.
So that was the task there.
Mm. Was there compassion directed to the self in that sequence?
Yes, we did direct those compassionate wishes to the self as well.
And I think you mentioned the heart rate variability being sort of measured along the way. People were also using the app though, weren't they? Across those, how did that bit of it work?
So basically, we would get them to come in, and then after the baseline period, they would resize the three circles according to how they'd been feeling, and they do that a lot, like basically after each phase of the experiment. So it was like post baseline, resize the three circles; after the rumination task, resize the three circles; after the recovery period, resize them; and then after the compassion task. So the idea was that in measuring the three circles after each period, or after each experimental phase, examining sort of the relation of those ratings with the heart rate variability heart rate variability metrics for each of those phases, and seeing if they kind of coalesce.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so it's kind of an ABA design, isn't it? Where we're trying to see what the heart rate variability and the three circles is kind of at rest, and then there's this sort of activity of in this case rumination over a stressful life experience, and then a return to rest or recovery, followed by the compassion exercise and measuring the three circles as well at the end of each of those phases. So let's get to the results. I mean, did the three circles, let's start with that perhaps, the three
Yeah.
circles, and did they sort of kind of behave in the way that CFT or your hypotheses might have predicted?
Yeah, for the most part. So we basically found from baseline to rumination, there was an increase in threat circle dominance, right? So that makes sense because you're ruminating, right? That's what it's meant to do. It's meant to trigger your threat system. And then we found a decrease in drive circle dominance, so a decrease in positive activated emotion, which also makes sense. Like, you're not experiencing a whole bunch of joy theoretically if you're thinking about something stressful. We didn't find a difference in terms of the soothing system or the green circle. It still decreased. It just wasn't significant. So it could be the case that if we had more power, that would have reached significance, or perhaps participants came in and they weren't feeling particularly soothed at baseline. Who knows with regards to that one. But then from, I guess, the reactivity or the rumination to recovery, we found a decrease in threat circle dominance, which again makes sense. Like you take away the negative stimulus, and or your rumination, and consequently, your threat system is going to decrease because it's no longer sort of, basically being stimulated. And then we also found an increase in green circle dominance or soothing circle dominance. So this is from rumination and recovery. Again, it's kind of like that relief emotion, right? Where it's like, okay, my I'm not currently in a state of threat, so my soothing system can come back up. It could also be the case that our participants started employing emotion regulation strategies of their own already. In that instance, like maybe they're already reappraising their emotions. We didn't find a change in drive circle dominance there, but it wasn't sort of, you wouldn't necessarily expect to. And then in terms of the change from recovery to compassion, we actually didn't find a whole lot, which was a little surprising to us. We found an increase in drive circle dominance. So, in as a result of the compassion task, people were experiencing, more positive activated emotions like joy. So evidently they derive some benefit from the compassion task, but we didn't find any change in terms of threat or soothing. And that could just be, I guess, resultant from ceiling effects, where it's like, the relief associated with no longer ruminating has resulted in, I guess, them being soothed enough and not threatened enough that, the compassion exercise itself isn't sort of giving them a whole bunch of additional benefits. I think what's more likely is they're already implementing emotion regulation strategies in the recovery period. So they're sort of not deriving a whole lot of benefit in that instance from additional emotion regulation strategies. But
Hmm.
largely what we found there was that, your three circles were, responding accordingly to that experimental manipulation.
So from rest to reactivity, threat went up, drive went down, soothing was about the same.
Yes, exactly.
From reactivity to recovery, threat went down,
Hmm.
soothing went up, and drive stayed the same.
Yeah.
And then from recovery to compassion, there wasn't much change in threat or soothing, but interestingly, drive went back up
Yeah.
at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. And one thing I wondered as I was reading the results was whether, because Paul Gilbert often says, that compassion is not the same as soothing system. That
Yes.
compassion
It's
incorporates
not
a
a benzo,
whole,
right?
that sort of thing, and that sometimes compassion might actually involve drive system activation. The kind of the energy to go
Exactly.
and sort of do something in a way, and sometimes it might involve threat system, and obviously just various combinations of all of them. I guess that was one thing I wondered, was maybe the compassion exercise might have made a shift in something that wasn't measured, a kind of a compassionate motivation that's not really represented in one or other of those three circles.
100%. That's what we were thinking as well. And we tried to pick a compassion task that would be sort of, I don't know, uh kind of simpler for that reason, so that hopefully we would see, you know, more of just like a change in soothing, rather than sort of picking a compassion task where it's sort of like, think about this other person's suffering, which might trigger the threat system again, right? If you're thinking about, this other person, undergoing something stressful or negative, you probably have a certain degree of empathy for that person, and you might sort of experience some threat activation. And then also, if we sort of then went from there, okay, think about what you might do to alleviate this suffering, or think about alleviating this suffering again, you might experience an increase in drive. And I think that would also be the case if we did it in a behavioral experiment, right? If we gave them a potential situation where they could alleviate that person's suffering, I think we'd see even more sort of drive system activation, because it's necessary to facilitate action. So I definitely think you might be onto something there.
I mean, the really cool bit of the study too was obviously the measuring the heart rate variability, which you've described. So what did you find there? And like when you compared maybe the three circles ratings with what was happening with people's physiology, how did they track?
Yeah, 100%. So we found basically from we use two different metrics of heart rate variability, by the way. That's just gold standard. Like I won't get into it because it's all technical and quite boring. But what we found was largely that from rest to reactivity, there was a decrease in heart rate variability, so indicative of sympathetic nervous system activation and decreased parasympathetic activation. And then from rumination to recovery, we basically found an increase in heart rate variability, right? So basically, again, reduced sympathetic activation and increased parasympathetic activation, and we found that that largely aligned with the changes that we saw in the three circles, where from rest to reactivity, you saw an increase in threat circle dominance, and then a decrease in threat circle dominance from reactivity to recovery. So largely what that was telling us was that the three circles is reflective of changes in physiology resultant from those experimental manipulations. Those two metrics aligned.
Hmm. Is HRV sort of like sort of high HRV parasympathetic, low HRV sympathetic then? Is it like just the flip side, or
That's the
does it
implication.
not measure
Like that,
sympathetic?
it can be quite complicated, and it's not necessarily that cut and dry, but that's largely sort of um, the what the implication there. It would have been cool as well if we'd been able to measure like an actual sympathetic indicator, so like electrodermal activity, for example, or pre-ejectory period. These are two measures of two explicit proxies for sympathetic nervous system activation. But we just went for heart rate variability for this one, which is a parasympathetic indicator. But because of those two systems, the two arms of your autonomic nervous system, a lot of the time kind of working like a seesaw, and sort of counterbalancing each other. That was what we inferred from the findings that we you obtained in terms of heart rate variability.
Mm, okay. So yeah, and there's this thing about sort of the key thing was the balance, I guess, between soothing and the other two systems that sort of mattered most, just rather than simply how much soothing was there, maybe. So could you
Yes.
unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked, because this brings us to the other metric of the three circles that we had tested through two papers before it. So initially we were interested in an overall imbalance variable, based on sort of that theory inherent to compassion focused therapy, where balance between the systems should facilitate emotion regulation, right? And so we first trialed I guess an imbalance variable, which was calculated via the standard deviation across all three circles. Basically, how much the circles are deviating from each other. We theorize that may be indicative of imbalance between the circles, and then that imbalance may be indicative of difficulties with emotion regulation. But basically, for the first two papers where we just did we I guess like delivered the three circles to young adults first, and then adolescents, alongside a battery of conventional self-report measures, so measures of emotion as well as psychological distress, difficulties with emotion regulation, and self-compassion. And what we found was that the imbalance variable was not predictive of those outcome variables at all. Like we found no significant results with the imbalance variable. And we theorize that that might be, resultant from the fact that a static optimum balance between the circles might not necessarily be reflective of emotion regulation, because your three systems should be, responding to environmental context. And so having just like a standard like flat rate balance between the circles, it, it isn't really compensating for your environmental stimuli. And what we found was correlated was we found the threat circle to be positively correlated with difficulties with emotion regulation and psychological distress, and negatively correlated with self-compassion. And we found the inverse for the soothing system. And so I guess that hinted to us like, okay, what appears to be particularly advantageous is, the ability to activate your soothing system to regulate less useful levels of threat and drive, appears to sort of mitigate against psychological distress and difficulties with emotion regulation, and appears to facilitate self-compassion. And so from there, we decided in the HRV study to trial, I guess, two like log ratio metrics of respectively green to not green, and red to not red. Based on those findings, we were sort of like, okay, well, maybe one of those ratios might be predictive of HRV. And what we found was that the ratio of not green to green appeared to be negatively correlated with negatively correlated with heart rate variability. So basically, the more you have of not green to green, the lower your heart rate variability appears to be across the entire experiment. And what appears, like inverse from that, what appears to, facilitate heart rate variability is that, having more green. Sorry, I was trying to put that in a way that it wasn't too jargony.
Well, it sort of kind of makes sense. It's sort of reassuring, isn't it,
Yeah.
for a clinician like me, because that's what we're trying to work towards. Is there a
100%.
way to bring that mind awareness that we mentioned early on at the start, and then to be able to do things, use little strategies or other activities that helps to kind of make a shift so that it's more green to not green, I guess,
Yes,
as opposed to not green to green.
absolutely.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So Paul often talks about the three circles, not so much as three groups of emotions, obviously, but as three patterns of brain and body functioning or brain states. I guess that's the thing about this study for me is that, especially with the psychophysiological work that you've been doing and the findings there, it really starts to, kind of broaden our sense of what these three circles might really be reflecting, sort of emotions, but the psychophysiology behind that, and perhaps motivations, as you also alluded to. But yeah, so how well does sort of all that stuff about brain states fit with your own thinking, or what you've come up with from this paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it kind of rubbed in the fact that those emotions aren't existing in isolation. Like obviously that there is a link between the emotions you're experiencing and your autonomic nervous system, and I think that uh, has sort of been, I don't know, foreshadowed for a while. Like if you think about sort of like dialectical behavior therapy techniques, where you might I guess like go have a cold shower to sort of reset your autonomic nervous system to alleviate sort of really not useful levels of threat, for example. I think, our study kind of lent more credence to that fact in terms of, establishing, okay, there is an association between, how your emotions are resultant from the experimental manipulation and how your physiology is.
Mm.
And, you can kind of you might experience that in day-to-day life too, in terms of like sometimes you don't necessarily know whether what you're experiencing right now is anxiety, for example, or whether you've just got a stomach ache, like maybe you ate something bad. And I guess it sort of, yeah, just like made that fact really salient to me. And definitely I guess echoed what Paul has been saying for a while now.
Mm. And it really speaks to the body-based work that we might do, as well as the imagery and the cognitive work,
Yes,
and also that felt sense of compassionate feelings, and the whole sort of model of compassionate action, and the skills that we might bring to that, I suppose. I mean,
absolutely.
what do you think all this means for the future of the three circles model?
That's a really good question. Obviously, I feel like it raises more questions than it answers,
It's
to
a
some
complex
degree.
thing. it's
Yeah.
complex, isn't it? And it's fun. It's good, but it is complex. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think there are a lot of implications and a lot of potential different directions to take this research in. For me, I'm most interested in sort of the practice, and integrating, this new measure that we've created into intervention contexts as psycho education in therapeutic contexts. I think that's what I'm really excited to see. But there are logical future steps in terms of research as well. So particular populations, they don't necessarily respond the same way as your standard community samples. In terms of soothing system activation or stimulation or compassion tasks. So, for example, young offenders, that great work by Sasha and colleagues over at the University of Coimbra, as well as Ribeiro de Silva, Diana Ribeiro de Silva. Like, I was hugely inspired by her program of research with the psychopathy.com program, which was administering, compassion-focused therapy to young offenders in detention centers in Portugal. They found reduced rates of recidivism, reduced levels of callous unemotional traits, like transition from shame-oriented thinking to guilt-oriented thinking. And I was, really excited by that. But in terms of, Salsa and Ribeiro de Silva examining, HRV patterns in young offenders, in terms of responses to soothing stimuli, they found a lot of the time it can provoke a stress response, in those populations. So I'd like to see similar work to what we've done, sort of validating the three circles in those populations in particular, as well as I guess in populations of participants with alexithymia. So alexithymia is like a subclinical feature of clinical disorders like autism spectrum disorder, where you don't necessarily know or you struggle to articulate the emotion you're experiencing. I think there are implications, of our measure being particularly useful for those populations because they don't have to sort of try and understand exactly which discrete emotion they're experiencing. They can just rate it according to the three systems, which is kind of, a simpler way of doing things, a more parsimonious way of doing things. So I'd like to see, some studies conducted with those demographics in particular, to establish whether the three circles is particularly useful for those populations.
Hmm.
But there are a whole bunch of potential avenues to take this research. I believe there's a Swiss team that are interested in utilizing the three circles in VR training for emotionally activating events to establish whether the sort of like the virtual reality manipulation of emotional activation is effective. And then obviously more studies utilizing the three circles to assess emotion in other contexts as well.
Hmm. This is just the beginning,
Yeah.
in a way. What are your thoughts? This is a bit of a selfish question, I suppose, but for a therapist like me, I mean, what are your thoughts about combining something like the Three Circles app with measures of HRV? Does it feel like that combination might have utility in a therapy setting, or does this paper really suggest that actually we could use the app and kind of just be assured that in some ways that is reflecting too what's happening, psychophysiologically?
Yeah, 100%. So I think the purpose of this paper for us, particularly, was was the latter. So that it's sort of like, okay, we've done it so you don't have to, hopefully. And it's sort of like, okay, we've kind of established in this paper that, those patterns of heart rate variability are kind of, they coalesce with the ratings of the three circles. So you can get some inkling as to how someone's autonomic nervous system is functioning from the three circles. Obviously, there, the more data you have a lot of the time, the clearer picture you have, and there would be benefits to measuring HRV alongside the three circles, but it can just be sort of quite noisy, the data a lot of the time. So that can just be sort of like, if your electrodes aren't stuck on real good, you don't necessarily get like a great recording. HRV can be quite underpowered if you're sort of like basically running a study with multiple people. You need quite a few people to get a clear picture of what's going on in terms of the overall HRV trends. So yeah, I think it's more the latter in this instance. But having said that, there's always benefits to taking additional measures, right? If it's not sort of causing too many issues, or taking too much time.
Mm. Awesome. Well, I'll definitely be linking your papers. I think there's a couple of lead up papers that you alluded to as well. So we'll link those in the description. And I might actually get off you a couple of the other papers that you've found interesting,
Yeah.
the Portuguese papers and things like that. And we'll also link the app. But yeah, Dr. Dylan Moloney-Gibb, well done. Congratulations on a wonderful study and a great PhD. Graduating in just a few days, I hear. So
Uh,
well done on that.
Thanks, Dan.
And thanks for coming and speaking with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
No, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. It's always a pleasure, but it's been a particularly great pleasure this time.
Okay, good.